We have to deal with the great, abiding, central questions about God, about meaning, about where my life is going, about death, the fact of death, the fact that I'm confronted with eternity. There's this life I'm leading, and then it's surrounded, as it were, by eternity. But those questions are so hard, and they're so challenging, and they're too immense. And so what I do is I distract myself endlessly from them.
Welcome back to the Word on Fire show. I'm Brandon Vogt, the host and the senior publishing director at Word on Fire. We love being distracted. Why is it so hard to sit still, quietly, and contemplate reality? And how can a 17th century philosopher help us escape this quandary? That's what we're discussing today with Bishop Robert Barron, who joins us as he usually does from our studio in Rochester. Bishop, welcome.
Hey, Brandon. Good morning. Good to see you as always.
You have had an extraordinarily busy last couple months, but probably the big event was your international travel to World Youth Day, which was in Lisbon, Portugal. Tell us how that went.
It was great. I loved it. I've been to 4 World Youth Days now. I was in Madrid, Krakow, Panama, and now Lisbon, and loved it. You get 1 million or whatever kids showing up, and we wandered around the city and was able to talk to all these different groups. I gave 5 separate talks. My favorite really was the evening with the English speakers, mostly American kids, like 15,000 in this big park. And we had Blessed Sacrament Adoration, great sacred silence, in that moment. I gave a little 20-minute sermon. Loved it. Loved the opportunity to reach out to the kids and to evangelize.
Well, I want to talk to you about one of our mutual heroes, Blaise Pascal. He was a 17th century French mathematician, physicist, Catholic philosopher. I studied engineering and physics in college, and those who have taken math or science courses will recognize that his name is what's used for the unit of pressure, that there's 5 pascals of pressure, 10 pascals of pressure. But he wrote a great philosophical work called the Pensées, where he famously observed this. He said, quote, "The sole cause of man's unhappiness is that he does not know how to stay quietly in his room." He also says in the Pensées that, quote, "Our nature consists in movement. Absolute rest is death." What's Pascal getting at here?
Oh, he's such an important figure. You're right. A fascinating figure. Dies young. He was only in his, late 30s, I think, when he died. But made this, as you say, massive contribution to the sciences and to computer technology. Pascal was behind much of that, too. And then he makes this extraordinary contribution to philosophy and theology. The Pensées are really one of the great literary works of that time, and they come down to us at such a high literary quality, but also of tremendous spiritual power. I think he's an undervalued person. When I was coming of age, we didn't read much of Pascal. I kind of discovered him later in life, and I think maybe you have to be a bit later in life to appreciate him, because you might read him and just find him kind of mordant and pessimistic, but he's not that. He's a real mystic, and he combines his mysticism with high intelligence. There he's like John of the Cross, right? The greatest spiritual master, but has a Thomistic sort of disciplined mind. Pascal is similar, but the Pensées are such a gem, set of... They were literally written on pieces of paper, and he strung them around his apartment in Paris. And they were collected after he died, and they think they were like preparatory notes for a great work of apologetics he was thinking about. But they've come down to us as little aphorisms. There he's a bit like Nietzsche. Nietzsche's writing is in aphoristic form, and Pascal is like that. But they're just gems, and you can chew on each one, and draw nourishment from them. Anyway, I forgot the original question you asked because I was going on about Pascal's life. It was, what's he getting at with the sitting quietly in a room, right? I think what he's getting at is we have to deal with the great, abiding, central questions about God, about meaning, about where my life is going, about death, the fact of death, the fact that I'm confronted with eternity. There's this life I'm leading, and then it's surrounded, as it were, by eternity. But those questions are so hard, and they're so challenging, and they're too immense. And so what I do is I distract myself endlessly from them. And I can't sit quietly in a room. Why? Because those questions will invade me. Those questions will come at me. Think of it as, that one of the more unpleasant experiences in life when you wake up in the middle of the night and you're lying in bed, and there's something about that time where your brain just starts sending anxious signals to you. And if you sit long enough, questions of, when am I going to die? And what happens after I die? And where am I going? And does my life mean anything? And those will come to you too. And so we want to avoid that. Take a pill so I can get back to sleep and not think about those things. Or let me get out of bed so get to work and I don't have to think about those things. To sit quietly in a room by oneself, not distracted by a book or anything, or now, look at us. We're masters of distraction with all our machines. Without those things, you can confront those questions for the first time, maybe. That's what he's driving at there, I think.
One thing that is interesting about Pascal is, almost as a master psychologist, he highlights the paradox that these diversions introduce. He says, and I'm quoting him, "The only thing that consoles us for our miseries is diversion, and yet it is the greatest of our miseries." Why did he consider diversions to be so problematic, first of all? But if they're so problematic, why do we still love to be diverted, to be distracted?
Yeah, because the questions are too much, right? The questions are too much. But that's the only way I'm really going to live, is by confronting those questions, which is why the diversions themselves become a source of misery, right? Because I'm going to live in a superficial way. If I'm diverting myself all the time, necessarily I'm living in a superficial way. So that produces its own misery, its own sense of absurdity. So that's why I'm kind of caught in a way. He was, long before the psychologists of the 20th century, he was so good at naming these kind of dilemmas we get ourselves into, these aporias, the philosophers call them, like these sort of impossible situations. And that's a good example, is that I can't distract myself. I must distract myself. And that's where I live, in that space. The saint, you might say, is someone who's able to set aside the diversions and engage those questions in a sufficiently serious and life-enhancing way, right? That's a saint. Or a real contemplative is able to do that. I think, Brad, like the times in my life when I've gone on a retreat and I go to a monastery, let's say, and I say, all right, this time I'm going to do it. This time I'm really going to, confront the great questions. And I'm not saying I do, but even in those settings, I find myself getting restless or bored or seeking some sort of distraction, whether that might even be like in a good book, but still the good book is distracting me from the question I should be dealing with. We can't sit quietly by ourselves. If we could, well, we might go crazy or we might become a saint,
I first got into Pascal through the work of Peter Kreeft. I think a lot of younger Catholics
people did, yeah.
First came that route. Kreeft has this great book called Christianity for Modern Pagans, which is an annotated version of Pascal's Pensées. And here's Kreeft's illustration of what Pascal's getting at. He says, quote, "If you are typically modern, your life is like a mansion with a terrifying hole right in the middle of the living room floor. So you paper over the hole with a very busy wallpaper pattern to distract yourself. Or, he says, you find a rhinoceros in the middle of your house. The rhinoceros is wretchedness and death. How in the world can you hide a rhinoceros? Easy. Cover it with 1,000,000 mice, multiple diversions." I think where Kreeft is most useful is he notes, affirming what Pascal says, that the distractions don't trouble us. We chase after them. We want to be busy. We want to be distracted. Because if we had true leisure, then we'd be forced to look at ourselves, to listen to our hearts, and see that great gaping hole that's right in the middle.
Yeah, and if you talk to most people, how you doing? Really busy. I'm really busy. And that's usually seen as kind of a positive thing. I think in my world of, priests, how's it going? Oh, man, I'm so busy. I am so busy. or like my own life. Oh yeah, I'm doing this, I'm doing that. And all right, I'm serving the kingdom. I'll tell myself, and it's probably true to a degree, but am I also just caught in a Pascalian game here, of like, I'm just distracted by all these activities and trips and, so it's a good way to examine your conscience. How am I using all this stuff in my life? Do you remember this scene in one of Woody Allen's early movies where he's an obsessive over the Kennedy assassination? And so he's with his girlfriend and suddenly he just breaks into more obsessiveness about the grassy knoll and the gunman. And then she says, I think you're using the JFK assassination to distract yourself from the trouble in our relationship. And then Woody, turns to the camera and goes, she's right. Well, that's a very Pascalian moment because I think a lot of us do that, whatever we're into. And then someone says, I think you're just distracting yourself from the question of life and death and meaning. I think you're right. So that's the covering the rhinoceros with the million mice, So what's the way out? I don't know, Brandon. It does take an extraordinary spiritual discipline to confront those questions honestly and with faith. That we do this, no one doubts it. That's clear. But how do we solve the problem? Pascal probably say, learn to sit quietly in a room. And, we might translate it into the language of contemplation. Set aside your obsessive activity and learn to be a contemplative more.
I think you're right. I think for Pascal, contemplation would be the antidote for distractions. I think, too, of Joseph Pieper, who wrote a lot on the theory of leisure and the need for true leisure. How do we distinguish between distractions, diversions, and true leisure, or from distractions? And can leisure ever turn into distractions? You gave the example of reading a book. A book, I think, can sometimes be leisure activity, sometimes distractions. How do we navigate that?
Yeah, I suppose you have to look at the big picture, don't you? Am I, as a general rule, avoiding the great questions, life and death, and meaning and purpose in God? Am I purposely getting away from all that, or are the things I'm doing, from reading a book to watching a baseball game to having a good, conversation, are they in service of these ultimate goods, and are they in relation to what I've determined about those great questions? Because, it's not a stark either or. I mean, I think if you have come to grips with those questions, then, you can live your life in a joyful way and you can give yourself to certain things and they're not functioning to distract you. So I think it's not an either or. Pascal can sometimes give that impression of being a sort of an either or thinker. But, prayer for us, I think, under Fulton Sheen's influence, when I started doing a holy hour every morning, did it this morning, in season and out, no matter what. Well, okay, that's trying to overcome the Pascalian problem. As I'm going to say, purposely, I never bring my phone into the chapel. It's on purpose, never bring it in. So at least for that hour, I'm in dialogue with God. The Psalms are leading me through a meditation on deep and important things. I'll set even that book of the breviary down and just spend some time, gazing at the tabernacle. So that in itself is a very Pascalian kind of discipline, isn't it? The holy hour. That at least for that hour, I'm guaranteed I'm going to be confronting the great questions.
I think up and down the centuries, one way that Christians have escaped diversions is by quite literally, physically fleeing them by going to the desert. The Bible and church history are filled with people who flee distractions by going into these isolated places. Why is the desert in particular so central to Christianity?
No, for just that reason. And because distractions fall away there. There's nothing to divert your attention from the great issues. And that's why so many, as you say, the biblical authors. Now, the Bible comes out of a desert culture. If you go around the world, it might be into the forest or into the tundra or something. But the idea is the same, that you have to get away from the distractions. Something we've done, as a church in the new program of priestly formation, we have a propedeutic year, we call it, a preparatory year before a guy enters the formal seminary process. And one of the features of it that I really like is there's a detox from social media. So we require the students to surrender their phones. And so for a year, and I think they can check them for emergencies and all that, but for a year, basically, they fast from the internet and from Facebook and everything else. And almost to a person, they will say, that was the most important part of the probedeutic year, was that I detoxed from the phone. That's a way we can do it. That's a very practical thing we can do. That's like a desert for a lot of us. Heck, I'm looking at my phone right now because I've set it aside during this conversation, but the minute we end, I'll probably check it. Now, part of that is emergencies, and I'm the bishop of a diocese, and I got to be attentive to that. But, even if it's the end of the day, there are no emergencies, I probably check the darn thing anyway. So that's a negative spiritually in our culture now.
I'm curious if you could maybe share personally how you escape diversions. You gave the example of your holy hour. You intentionally leave the phone behind, but
Right.
when you sense yourself becoming overly attached to diverting activities, how do you escape that in your life?
Yeah, well, that's the number one thing I'd say is prayer, is and to concretize that with the holy hour, and give oneself to the works of love or the work of service in some basic way. Return to the gospel fundamentals, I would say, prayer and service and study and so on. But I tell you, whenever I read Pascal, I feel judged in a good way. I know he's naming something that's very real in my own life. And there's a how would I describe it? There's a texture to the feeling that comes from spending too much time with distractions. You know what I mean? For Pascal himself, by the way, it was gambling. Because he was so good a mathematician that he was good with cards and all that. And so he would fritter away enormous amounts of time gambling. And you think, here's one of the great geniuses of the Western world. And he knew, I wasted so much time. And I'll find Brandon at times during the day, and it's this symbol now we all have, the thumb, of we're going through the Facebook or scrolling through whatever. And after a while, it's like it's a sickness. You feel sticky or unwell. Why am I looking at these silly pictures and Facebook, whatever they are? Why am I looking at this? But his answer is, it's not just, because they're mildly entertaining. There's something distracting that your soul doesn't want, the deep stuff. And so it's attracted weirdly to this superficiality. But maybe let that feeling sink in and say, boy, I need the desert right now. I need some desert time.
It reminds me of something we've discussed before when we've talked about social media. In that famous Netflix documentary, The Social Dilemma, They point to the invention of the infinite scroll as one of the worst features of social media, because there's no end to the distraction. It just keeps going and going and going.
It's that, right, it's that weird thing in our psychology that you're looking at this silly, set of whatever they are, but another one's coming. This could be something really interesting. And to be fair, sometimes, sure, I do come across interesting articles or, I want to see what's going on there. So as you're going through, that's stupid, I don't want to waste the time, that's ridiculous. But there's one more coming, and that could be the one that's going to get my attention. And you just have to, I don't know, those things are very, they're dangerous spiritually. And I don't just mean pornography and these really explicit things, but I mean, just that dynamic is dangerous spiritually. And Pascal should be the patron saint, maybe, of our time for that reason. The very fact that he's behind computers, in a way, his theorizing was behind computer technology, and he's the great prophet of distraction, So that's interesting.
I think Crave said he's the first great post-medieval apologist, and he was born 300 years before his time. That, as you say, he could be the patron saint of our digital age.
He's buried in the Saint-Étienne-du-Mont in Paris. I used to go by it all the time. And in those days when I lived in Paris, I knew the name Pascal, but I had not really read him at all. But I used to walk by his tomb all the time when I was in Paris.
Well, it's time now for our question from one of our listeners. If you have one for Bishop Barron, you can send it in to us at the website askbishopbarron.com. Today we have one from Jack in Louisville, Kentucky. He's asking about the laity in the church. Here's Jack's question.
Hi, Bishop Barron. This is Jack from Louisville, Kentucky. What are some things we as lay people can do to build unity in the church?
Yeah, good. Stop being cruel to each other. We're talking about the internet a lot today. I mean, the amount of cruelty that's expressed on the internet, and I suppose there are some clerics on the internet, but it's 99% lay people. Stop being cruel to each other. Stop using people as a means to an end. When you're dealing with someone, let's say on the internet, can you really say, when I send this response or this comment, I'm doing it out of love? I'm willing the good of the other. If you can say that, hit the button, off you go. Can't, don't do it. Stop being cruel. On the positive side, I would say do the works of faith, hope, and love. That's what you're called to do. The laity are meant to go into the world, into the secular space, and bring grace there. You bring faith, hope, and love. And that will, by its very nature, bring about unity, because those are the theological virtues. So stop being cruel. Start spreading faith, hope, and love.
Well, as we wrap up here today, I'd like to share with you the first book by Word on Fire's new Spark imprint for young kids, Spark being a little flame. So this is our imprint of books for children and other young readers. The first book we're releasing is called Saintly Creatures and Their Holy Companions, just debuted. Inside this book, you will discover exciting tales of God's creatures and the holy men and women they encountered. You'll read about an enormous dog who protected a French priest from an ambush, a tiger who shared his cave with persecuted Korean Christians, a dangerous wolf who was tamed by an Italian friar, and a boar who was rescued from hunters by a wise Irish abbess. Each of these 14 stories shows the heroic virtue of the saints and inspires young readers to faithfully follow Jesus. If you're a parent, grandparent, aunt, uncle, sponsor, this is a great book to get for your kids and introduce them to the saints. Again, it's called Saintly Creatures and Their Holy Companions, first book from Word on Fire Spark, and I'll be sure to include a link in the show notes. Well, thanks everyone for watching and listening, and we'll see you next time on the Word on Fire show.